So, okay, cool. I think we're good. So yeah, just a very brief introduction. I mean, firstly, thank you so much. Like, I have been downloading your charts probably for the last 10 years and
Amazing.
um and following your journey and all things like that. And so basically this podcast started out of a need to kind of I'm a professional player. I play on cruise ships mainly at the moment. And so, but I started the podcast when I was in university because I was finding this trend with like magazines and interviews and things like that, or even video clips that I would see from like Pasic and all those sorts of things. And all that they were ever interested in was what gear someone's using on their last tour, or what, which is cool in itself, but no one was ever asking like how they did it, or like, what steps they took or what they read in order to kind of like aid them in that like journey of discovery to get where they were, who they spoke to, what area they lived in, was there an influential moment, like those sorts of like actual questions that I personally found like super interesting about our jobs. And
Yeah.
so it started off, I was just emailing a bunch of people and just asking them for like a quick call that I wasn't going to record or anything, that I just wanted some advice. And then as the time went on, the advice was so useful. I was like, I'm pretty sure most people would benefit from like
Right.
hearing that advice, So then it started like that. And then, people have been very kind with their time. And so here we are.
Yeah. Awesome.
But like I said, I think you are, we're going to talk about this, but you are certainly my favorite drum charter on the planet. I think you're absolutely
Oh,
phenomenal.
wow.
I think you're like just insane, and I love the way you play, and you just come across so well on social media and things like that. And so that was my main motivation to get you on the podcast. So thank you.
Wow. That's a lot. That's very kind. I say it all the time, but like, I actually just had a student who's from London who was in town that came and had a lesson here. And he was leaving, he was like, man, it just means so much. Like your stuff is so great. And he had a lot of kind things to say. And when you put out so much stuff on the internet, it can be really hard to know whether any of it is ever landing. Like I'm sure I mean, like and it's no different than sometimes you play a show and you're on stage and you're like, do people care? Or are people just here to drink, or do they not like the music, or like what's going on? And then after the show, someone walks up and says like, hey, this is my first concert ever. You sounded amazing. I've always liked drums. And you go like, oh, wow. I on stage the whole time didn't think that was the great show. And here's this one person. And I think a lot of times it's true of content. You put something out, it gets half the views you thought it would, and you go, ah. But then someone DMs you and goes like, hey, that clip is so amazing. Like, what is the feel? Like your kick drum sounds so great. Like, I can't believe it. And you're just like, wow, okay, that's awesome.
But I also think you individually are a novelty in the terms of you're so kind with your time. And, we're going to get on this later. I've got a question about art versus commerce and things like that. But like you give away just so much stuff. Like I read your Zildjian live charts and your Vic Firth jams charts like before bed, like when I on the ship, I'm literally on Fourscore, like literally just reading the charts and then just like noticing patterns that Benny Greb will play might be exactly the same as Chris Coleman, but they're just phrasing it differently over different things. Like that journey of exploration is so clear when you read it there, because there's no, I guess that's why people, I hate math personally, but that's why people I know love math, because it makes sense in every language,
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's the same with drum notation, like Chris Coleman will play a diddle sixes, and then that'll lead you down a whole rabbit hole of, well, he diddles the last one in one of the charts that you did, his go with Vinnie Colaiuta. I think you did like a double chart. And there was just one, he only used it once, and it was at the end, and it was a 6-stroke roll, but it was right, left, right, right, left, left. But then he put a kick after the last left, and he made it like obviously the 12 note one instead of a 6. And I saw that and I was like, God, I've never seen that before or heard that before. And then I went on this whole rabbit hole of discovery to try and find like diddle sixes in every combination, and there weren't any. So then I ended up writing the whole thing. And now that has led me somewhere. So it's like, and that's all because you put that time and effort in and gave that away for nothing,
Well, I appreciate that, man. Yeah, it's fun. The two transcriptions you're talking about, the Chris Coleman and the Vinnie Colaiuta, the reason they're partnered together is because, um, growing up, it was like the very, 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 very early years. Like, how old are you?
28.
Okay, so I'm 31. So, you know, like when I started playing drums when I was 10, that was like early internet days. There was no YouTube yet. So if you like there wasn't the same thing where you think in your head, I want to know about something, you just go to the internet and you can find 17,000 videos of it. So there was really only two places online that had drum stuff, and it was Vic Firth's website. They would post like quick time clips that would take forever to load, and they were like 2 minutes long, and then drummerworld.com. And drummerworld.com, just like you're saying, would give away so much stuff for free. They had clips of like every drum DVD that was coming out. They had transcriptions uploaded by different people so drummerworld.com for me was like the spot where I learned so much. I learned what like a cross stick was because I was watching a Steve Gadd clip, and I was like, whoa, you can click the stick on the side of the rim like that. That's crazy. And so, doing stuff like the VF Jams things and all that stuff, like there's this cool thing where, because of, how lucky I've been to like be a part of some of those projects, like I have that Chris Coleman and Vinnie Colaiuta transcriptions, those are on Drummer World now. And I'm like having this full circle moment of, there were people when I was young that were putting things onto the internet for free because they were just nerdy about drums, that were the reason I learned some of the stuff that I did, or the reason I discovered some of the drummers I did. And then now I'm having this cool moment of like full circle thing where hopefully some of the stuff I'm creating becomes this thing where 15 years from now, this person goes like, I had no idea how Vinnie Colaiuta was playing blah, 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 but your transcription helped me or whatever. So
I've had a million moments like that already.
yeah, man, it's really, really cool to, and when I did the first VF Jams project, um, they didn't have a huge budget, and they weren't even planning on doing like, because the transcriptions were an afterthought. Like they had spent a ton of money, like getting that band together, getting all those drummers there, producing it, editing the video and whatever. And they just kind of as an afterthought were like, hey, maybe we could transcribe some of these. I think originally we were only going to transcribe like part of a couple of the things. And then it just kind of blossomed into this whole thing. And like the whole time I was like, man, it's going to be a lot of work. I was a little scared because I was like, I've never really transcribed like multiple 8-minute long, like essentially like drum solos.
Yeah.
I've never really done a project that is that large of a scope, especially on a platform that's this big, especially with the drummers that are doing the like all the transcriptions I had done at that point was like I'd transcribe Vinnie Colaiuta, and I can promise you Vinnie Colaiuta has never looked at that transcription. But now it's like, well, this transcription is going to go out to like the whole internet, and Benny Greb is going to double check the transcription before it goes out, and it's like, well, that's a whole different commitment. So it was a little nerve-wracking, but the whole time I was just trying to remember like this could be one of those things that someone sees it and falls in love with that certain drummer, and because there's a transcription, they take it home and they have this aha moment that maybe pushes them in a direction that, I don't know, they might have just gotten deeper into basketball because that project didn't take hold of them like it could or whatever. And like, I just try to always think about, and I don't know, maybe in a business sense, I'm shooting myself in the foot because someone's like, why would I pay for an Aaron Sterling transcription book when, you already have 3 of them out for free or whatever. But, I think there's also people like you that see the value in it. It's not just collecting the transcriptions, but it's like when you can have a whole book of Aaron Spears' work, it's not that I don't think the most beneficial thing is learning every single solo or transcription note for note, but it's the ability to look through the whole thing and go like, oh, wow, like, okay, when he plays this certain phrase like this, he plays it as 32nd notes, but then he plays the same phrase, but it's actually kind of 16th note triplets and all, exactly like you were saying. Like, I think it's weird being the transcription guy these days, because the transcription is really kind of just like, a lot of people treat it as the finish line, but it's really just kind of the jumping off point. And for a lot of those transcriptions, it's like the thing I really do want people to do with it are exactly what you said. Find this one little 6-note grouping and then find every variation of it. And then by the end of that exercise of taking this one thing you saw in the transcription and then making a bunch of variations of working through them, you've now actually gotten to a place where you have interesting, unique vocabulary, not, oh, I have the transcription, I'm just going to play exactly what they played. And that's really the goal. So it's cool to hear that which is not a surprise, like you're doing it for a living. So you've figured out how to, piece those dots together. But all right, I've been monologuing for a while.
Oh no, you're good. There becomes this like I think it happened during COVID. The best thing that came out of it is I had just had time for the first time in probably 3 or 4 years to just sit down and go through things. And I wanted to become better at like linear drumming, like that sort of thing. Like I love like Lionel Lewis, J. Rod Sullivan, Benny Greb in all of those senses. And I love the way that they work around those things. So years and years and years ago, I downloaded Mike Johnson's linear drumming patterns or something, but I just took it as read. So I was like playing these gigs and I was like, God, what was pattern number 54? Oh, it was this, I think, right? And so I wanted to snap myself out of that. And so slowly but surely, with the obviously help of your charts and with the help of that understanding, something just clicked where I was like, well, what if we take the table of time and we just improvise through every line of the table of time? That maybe will be like step 1, say. And then so you would say like on the first line, on quarters, you would just do like kick, snare, kick. You would just in a random order. Then you would go to the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, all the way up to 12. And I would work through that. And then I was like, the table of time for me is like, that is like if there was one piece of paper that I could give to any drummer on the planet, and I would say this, everything you want to know and need to know within relevancy is in this one document. Anything that these pros play is in this document. And you just have to it's almost like you have to comprehend it to be able to see it. So then since I started that process, then I was like, okay, well, then maybe the next stage I can jump between them, because that's what the pros are doing. The pros are doing, 1 beat of 5, 1 beat of 6, 8, back to 3, and then something else. And that's where they're getting all their interesting ideas from. And then when it really ramped up is where I started to take away the notes. So they were hearing, and then that's why your charts helped me so much, is because I could visualize. There's a Benny Greb thing that he does, when he rolls off the first tom and then he leaves a bunch of gaps, and then it sounds like he's randomly just hitting whenever he wants to. And it sounds really jarring when you don't know what he's doing. But because you've written it out, he's just picking a note from each sextuplet.
Yeah.
And then when you understand that, you look at the sextuplet and you're like, well, I know exactly what he's doing. It's literally right there. It's in that one line. You can see it. And so then you start improvising with that. And then I think that's when those ideas really start to formulate that make you a unique musician, because you find these guys, they're not playing different notes particularly. They're phrasing them differently, or the intonation is different, or they're being orchestrated differently, and I think the only reason I came to that comprehension is because of like the charts that you make, and really, like you said, just seeing them for more than what they are, rather than just thinking, oh, this Aaron Spears fill was cool between the ride and the floor tom, I'm just going to do that in the most irrelevant, I'm going to do that in a song that doesn't call for it whatsoever. And then, when you start to really look into those things and really take them out of their context, and then you look at, like you said, you look at the variations, or you look at the jumps between them, and it's mad when now you look and you think like everything that someone's going to play now, you can kind of understand what it is they're doing. I might not have the technical capability to pull half the things they're doing off, but at least you have that comprehension. And for me, I think everything starts with comprehension. You can always build up the speed or the technical abilities or the hand techniques, foot techniques to get to that level. And a few weeks ago, this is complete separate tangent, but I read Effortless Mastery.
Yeah.
And I think because I think I saw it on your story, ironically,
Mhm.
and I listened to it on Audible, and it was amazing. And I just think the one phrase that stuck with me from that book is just what was it? Unfamiliar, not difficult.
Yeah.
That was the one thing that just stuck in the forefront of my mind. So when I watched J. Rod Sullivan do, Breathing by Ariana Grande, and he's doing all this super cool shit, it's not that I don't understand it. It's more the fact that I'm not there yet,
Yeah.
And
And I
so I
think
just
that
think
like,
it's so interesting just coming from what you can provide. I think it's phenomenal.
well, I think I appreciate it. And I think that like, it's funny because a lot of people think like, oh wow, that that fill you're seeing J-Rod play is like so hard and fast. And we think like, oh, the hardest thing to do is play fast. And in reality, like when you really think about it, the hardest thing a drummer has to do is, you know, play all four limbs at the same time. That's actually, as far as like physically speaking, like that's the hardest thing we have to do. And like the thing that made me, I don't know, when you start transcribing, you start realizing that like, so the most difficult stuff to transcribe is not, because everybody's like, man, how long did it take you to transcribe that solo? And in truth, like a lot of solos are actually really easy to transcribe, because when you look at, if you can slow down someone's playing in a solo, it's usually one note at a time or two notes at a time, because it's just like, it's 16th note triplets or 32nd notes or whatever, but it's one note at a time. It's that linear playing that you're talking about. When someone's playing a groove, like Stanley Randolph in like the VF Jam stuff was some of the hardest stuff to transcribe, because like there's not a moment. And I just did a Dave Weckl transcription for a client, and like almost every single moment of the transcription, there's like something going on with the left foot. He's playing kick drum notes, and sometimes like ghosted kick drum notes and spots, and then he's always playing ghost notes with the left hand, and then the right hand's always doing something. And when you're having to pay attention to four of those, like that's actually a lot harder to transcribe, and it's also a lot harder to play than these patterns that have just like that are one note at a time, that are just sped up really fast. And I think that it's interesting when you start transcribing, like there is a commonality where like, I've transcribed so much stuff, and like the level of, you can almost always correlate like how like renowned is the player with how much subtlety there is in their playing. And almost always like the drummers like Jojo Mayer, Vinnie Colaiuta, Chris Coleman, like all of those people you think of when you think like they're the legends, it's not just their soloing that's fast, but it's also like they have some level of mastery of like they are able to play with all four limbs, multiple things at a time. And then there are really great players who are solid that are like so easy to transcribe, because they just don't have that same level of complexity. When they're grooving, it's oftentimes just two limbs involved. So I think that like there is an interesting study to be had with like in reality, like Aaron Spears. I've transcribed a lot of Aaron's. Aaron Spears, like he is an incredible drummer, obviously, but has a very different, like when he's grooving, he's not always using left foot when he's playing ride cymbal and things like that. Like, so it's really interesting how much you can tell from a player, and just like how much you can observe just by like what, when they're playing groove, how much is going on. Like, is it mostly just like rim shots and ghost notes, or like someone like Aaron Sterling transcribing his stuff, there's like rim shots, there's ghost notes, there's like kind of ghost notes, there's kind of almost rim shots, there's rim shots at the edge of the thing. Like it's just really interesting. I think that people, there's only so much you can put on a page with transcriptions.
Yeah.
And I have a course, this isn't a pitch, but I have a course that I sell called Drumming Minimalism, which like it just, I think people don't understand like what it is, because I didn't really understand what it was until I put it together. But basically, like I transcribed a bunch of my own playing, and then I analyze it and talk about, like there's like 5 different categories for each transcription that I talk about: touch, tone, I don't even remember the other ones. But like what I was trying to get at is like, you have a transcription, here are tools you can use to look at those transcriptions so that you can get more out of every transcription you look at, that isn't just like, oh, it's 8 notes in a row and it's right hand and then kick and then left hand and then, and yeah, it's just really interesting because I feel like transcriptions, it's very easy to take, you know, again, I just always go back to it. People think like, oh wow, this person has transcribed Vinnie Colaiuta, look at these notes on a page. And it's like, yeah, that is technically all the air quotes notes that were played, but you know, there's just only so much you can put on that page, and unless people are doing like what you're doing, like comparing it to the original recording and then diving into like smaller sections of it and seeing where else it shows up in the thing, and then realizing like, oh, the snare drum he was playing was tuned like really high up, which means the snare sounds like this, but when he does rim shots it sounds like, there's always more subtle nuance than, you know, notes on a page are going to give you.
Yeah, I think nuance is the probably perfect word, to be honest. And that's something that I think a lot of drummers don't pick up on. When they listen to recordings and stuff, they're just like, oh, okay, if this is a ride pattern, and then they're just playing, you know, kick and snare. But what they're not seeing is like, well, where on the ride are they playing it? Like, are they where on the drum head are they striking the drum? Like, is it a rim shot? Is it center of the head? One of the biggest lessons I ever had was from my drum teacher called Doug Harper in London. He plays for the Book of Mormon, and he was saying like, you know, you don't have to make everything a rim shot. You know, I played it, like he was like, play something for me, so I played it, and he was like, you know, there are many ways to like play, you know, like even the snare drum, like you could play that a million different ways. And so that started to open my eyes to those sorts of things. And then when you start to hone in on listening to those things, you can even start to pick out like where on the hi-hat, where the stick is landing, you know, is it the tip of the stick? Is it the shaft of the stick? How tight is the hi-hat? I think when you start delving into those sorts of things, I think it's those nuances that really can separate the average weekend player to, you know, someone who is very into, and they can really emulate the sound of that band, for instance, even though they're playing the same kit, but they're playing 30 different songs a night, you know, even in a wedding gig, say. I think one of the best videos I ever watched was Steve Jordan did a clinic in London somewhere, like an Institute of Music in London. And he said, someone come up and play me a groove. He said, I will like live help you improve it, no end, and I'll keep it exactly the same. The groove won't change. So he got this guy up, and this guy played just a standard drum beat. And Steve Jordan was like, okay, cool. He was like, you know, now just like look at how you can change it. And he went, the only thing he changed was that he just dug into the hi-hats with the shaft of his stick a touch more, and it changed the entire sound. And that was his entire point. He was like, one thing like that can make the biggest difference, but you have to know that, you know?
You have to know it. You have to pay attention to it. It's funny, like, because now most of, you know, I still play live a little bit, but a lot of the stuff I do is like recording drums from here. And it's funny, like sometimes I'll be like, man, I think I have this awesome part, and I'll do a first take of it and I'll listen back and just be like, why? It's just not quite, it's not doing what I want it to. And then sometimes it really is just a simple thing of like, oh, right now I'm playing the hi-hat where I'm playing eighth notes, but I'm accenting the each beat. And what it really needs to be is just every single eighth note is even. So instead of it's and that's a thing where like literally if you write that out, I would say like most people that would write that on a piece of paper would notate it the same way. But in the execution of the thing, the music can sometimes tell you that like, no, it really doesn't need to feel like each beat. Everything needs to feel even so that it drives harder, so that it matches the energy of both. Like, you know, there's all this kind of stuff that I feel like a lot of times transcriptions are getting at, and the way people approach transcribing. And I mean, even larger, zooming out more, like a lot of people who approach education in music and really everything, but I'll specifically talk with music because I feel like I know a little more about that than everything. So I feel like a lot of times with education, we're getting at the what of something, like what did Vinnie Colaiuta play? what did Dennis Chambers play? But we're not getting at the why. And the why, oftentimes, if you know the why, the what will be the natural default because of why you chose to do something. But if you're always learning the what, then you're never really getting to a place where you're creating like creativity, or you're creating like musical intuition, because you don't know why, you just know what. So every new situation, you're kind of like still asking like what needs to go here, and you're not really focusing on like, okay, I feel like the, a lot of times, like with students, it's so interesting, whatever someone sits down and plays, oftentimes I'll ask them, oh, hey, you went to the ride cymbal 4 bars into the chorus. Like, why'd you do that? And they'll be like, I don't know. And I'm like, it's not a good answer. We need a better answer. Because even if I disagree with, and that's the kind of stuff that like we think it's semantics, or we think that like it's rule following. It's really not. Like, as an audience member, even if I don't like your decision, or even if I'm not a music person and I don't understand that the music of what's going on, a lot of times like audience members know that you're on stage and you randomly went from ride cymbal to hi-hat in the middle of the chorus. That's not necessarily something they'll be able to articulate, that like that's what you did, but a lot of times they'll have a feeling of like, this doesn't feel as good as I want it to, or whatever. And it's like, I had a student where she was talking about how she was at this classical concert, and there was a pianist giving like a concerto situation, and she was saying like, I don't know, I just didn't feel connected to the music. And I was like, yeah, oftentimes that's because, and that's like why effortless mastery is so great, is he talks about so many things that are going on inside your brain as you're performing, that show up to an audience member as, they're not thinking a lot of times about how like, oh, I didn't play that chord voicing right, and I'm not playing the swing exactly correct, or whatever. They're not processing that information, but you are. And that's adding layers of disconnect between you being present and the audience member, like essentially like meeting you where you're at. And I think that, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's really hard to be present when you're on stage, but like one of the things that I'm trying to get better at teaching is how to be more present when you're playing your instrument, and how to be listening to your instrument as you're playing, so that you can get at some of the subtleties you were just talking about, where it's like, oh man, like right now I'm hitting rim shots and it feels just a little too aggressive. Like I should maybe back off and just play. And sometimes that can be because of the music. Sometimes that can be because of the room you're in. Sometimes that can be because you can see the vocalist is kind of like not quite as comfortable as they usually would be when they're singing this verse. And it's like, okay, I can make this adjustment. But if you're not listening, if you're not asking like why, you're just focused on the what, you go, well, my chart says that I play the groove like this, and this is how I practiced it, so this is what I'm doing. And a lot of times like that focus on the correct way, or the what of it all, takes you out of being fully present and making better decisions, because you're more fluidly able to like adjust to what's going on around you.
Yeah. And I think, when you play with transcriptions and things like that, like the notes on the page can take you so far, but you have no idea what the intonation of those are going to be, because obviously how are you going to chart it that, one snare or a period of snare hits, if they're either, you can kind of chart it, they're either ghost notes or they're not, or it's like ghost notes, they're not, or they're accents. But those real subtleties that blur those lines, you only get that from like watching, and engaging with that material that way. So what I would do, I really wanted to get better at halftime shuffles, because I think before I read Benny Greb's Effective Practice for Musicians, I think I was just juggling too many balls at one time, or spinning too many plates. And I was like, right, I need to be good at this. And then the one thing that book did for me was like, just like write down the characteristics of your favorite drummers, notice the top 5 characteristics and just work on those. And then these are the exercises that I think work best on those. And so one of the exercises I came up with was, well, Ash Sohn for me is one of the best shufflers, obviously halftime shufflers out there. So I got one of his videos and I uploaded it to Logic. And then I have a Yamaha EAD. So I would record myself playing next to him. And then I would just go in and out of mine and his. And I would try and get mine as close to the sound that he was getting. But in order to do that, you had to really, really look at what he was doing and really like listen to those nuances, like how quiet, like, and then what I found was like, maybe my ghost notes were a bit too loud, you know? So then you bring your ghost notes down and you get that much closer. And then you think, fuck, like, okay, like, well, that had a big impact on the sound. Well, he's not hammering his bass drum every time. You know, some notes are ghosted and some aren't. I think there can be a common misconception. Again, that's why I love Benny Greb when he did the internal mixing board thing, you know, that exercise where you can bring each limb down at will whenever you want to. I think that was so important because I think people get under the misconception of like, well, if it's going to be a kick drum, it's going to be in the head and it's going to be the same volume every time for every song, for every phrase, for everything you do. And I think one of the biggest things in terms of that was learning how to play out from Jojo Mayer's Modern Weapons for the Modern Drummer 2 with the foot pedal, because it gives you those options, you know, and then like that's where that path leads. You see some drummers and they only play in. You never, ever, ever see them play out. And then you think like, well, like I wonder what it'd be like to be able to do both though, you know, and then and then that takes you down a different road. And then that can completely change your sound again, because you have the ability to do either, you know, and that's what I love about this musical journey. You know, I don't think anyone's ever truly going to get there, like to, you know, where they really, really want to be. I'm sure even the greats that we consider are not where they would, you know, where they still want to be. But I find that journey of education just like insanely fascinating. That one thing, it just opens up a whole can of worms for another thing. And then you're in there, you know, like just from that one exercise, when you notice Ash is playing out, you think, well, that must affect the sound then. So then you're like, well, now I'm going to have to go and that's something that I'd be interested in doing. And then you spend the best part of a year unlearning how to always play in.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think that you're right. You know, I think it's interesting because you were just talking about how like I don't think anybody arrives at being done. And I think that that's been the thing that when I reread Effortless Mastery in the last year or so, like rereading it, I think what it made me realize is like, I think I started doing this in college. I essentially tried to, in my practice time, build in the majority of the practice time where I'm like really focused on details and making sure that I'm locking in with the click and learning this new coordination thing and blah, 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 and all of that stuff. But then always having a period of my practice time where I do something creative and I have no purpose other than I just need to explore and like try to, you know, I've been working on X technique or this fill or pattern or whatever. Let me just for 10 minutes mess around and see what I come up with no other rule other than I'm just going to spend 10 minutes just trying to like do this thing. And I think what I didn't realize that was doing was helping me separate analytical, you know, because when you're playing drums, it just because you're playing drums doesn't mean you're being creative. Just because you're playing drums doesn't mean that you're being like, I don't think people talk enough about the experience of playing drums, and because it's kind of hard to talk about and it's so personal for everyone. But I think the two categories that I've like settled on is like, I know that there's a way that I play drums where every note I'm playing, I'm thinking very critically of like, is this working and is this locking in and is my kick drum doing the thing that I want it to? And that's one way of playing drums, very analytical. And then the other way is just like trying to prioritize playing drums, not being critical, and just listening to, okay, I'm hitting the snare drum. What does it sound like? How does it make me feel? What does it make me want to do next? Those are two very different things. And both are necessary to be a full musician. And we only, in education especially like I went to music school and got a music degree for whatever that is worth. And in music school, all they talk about is like, learn this and do this and exercises this and play this song like Art Blakey and whatever. And none of it focuses on like, oh, how can you foster essentially like a mindfulness practice for when you're playing? Because on stage, when you are playing a gig, and you know this because you do it, like when you're playing a gig, if you are thinking about the email you just wrote, if you are thinking about how you sounded better last week, if you are thinking about like this crowd is super dead and doesn't seem into it, like whatever you're thinking about that isn't you listening to what you're doing and reacting to the musicians around you, if you're thinking about anything else outside of that, it's not helping you, period. And I think that there's so many drummers that get on stage and all they're thinking about, literally the only thoughts they're having are, this doesn't sound good. I don't think this sounds as good as when I practiced it. Like, I don't think this is locking in. Like, I think I could be locking in with the click track better. I think blah, blah, blah. And not only is that not a very fun experience, but all of it is just actually making you sound worse. And I think that like it's similar to like I have anxiety, and I think that it's similar to an anxiety response where, you know, it's technically like my anxiety a lot of times is technically like a defense mechanism to supposedly help me. Like when something bad happens, you know, or you know, like okay, like we're gonna get severe weather tonight. I know that, and my brain starts going like it's going to be severe weather. I start to get anxious about it because of, in theory, it's like, hey, we need to make sure that, you know, the furniture on the patio is put away. Like we need to make sure that, you know, the gutters are cleaned out so they don't overflow. Like there's all these things that like that initial like fear could get me to do that would maybe help me in the situation. But then there's also a point where there's diminishing returns and it just becomes, well, what if this happens? 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 And then you get into the spiral that's not actually, it maybe initially started as like, hey, let's just make sure we've done everything we can do to be safe in this situation. It starts there, but then it becomes, well, we could lose the house. Well, we could blah, 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 blah. Like, what if the basement floods? What if the blah, blah, blah? And then it becomes this really unhelpful thing. And I think that that's really what a lot of people are experiencing when they're performing is they spend all this time practicing. And when they're practicing, it's beneficial to think like, how could I be playing this song better? Is this locking in as good as I can? Am I using the technique? Am I using German grip on the blah, blah? Like all of that stuff can be really helpful. But in a live performance situation, the most important thing is the audience that's there, and then you making as much of a connection with them and the other musicians on stage as you can. And any thought that's taking you out of that, like, could this be locking in better? Could this, whatever, like at some point I think you have to when you're playing live, you have to decide like in real time, like, I'm playing this song and now I'm having this thought about X. The next question should be like, can I actually solve this problem while I'm playing this show? And if the answer is no, then you have to do whatever you can to drop that. Like if the thought is, hey, my music stand is falling over right now, you actually might need to get sucked out of the performance for a second and like figure out how to save your music stand from falling over. Or like, hey, I just lost my in-ears and I can't hear anything. I maybe need to as not distractedly as I can figure out like why I have no monitor mix anymore. But like if the thought is I think I was playing this better last week, it's like, well, this is not there. This is a totally arbitrary, there's no way that you can fix that, or there's no way to know in real time if that's even true. That's not helping anyone. And I think that like we just don't talk enough about how to play from a space of like being present, because I think it's honestly just so hard in life to be present. that it's not super surprising that most education isn't focused on how to help you have a good time or how to help you be present. It's mostly focused on like how to be good or how to be um yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think musical education, for as amazing as it can be for that initial introduction, I think can kill. I've seen so many musicians killed off by it because they had a 6 out of 10. What does that mean? What does that
Yeah.
mean? What does that mean? Oh,
Yeah.
I had a fucking merit in my grade 5. So, like what? Like I've
Yeah.
never done grades. I just follow what I like, and I just made it my mission. There are certain things I think you need to become really accomplished at if you want certain gigs. So, like reading, you cannot do a cruise ship gig if you don't read. And if you don't want to read, and then you willingly will sacrifice those sorts of jobs. But then I think that's what the education system can do, is like you're in university and the next drummer has got a 70 out of 100 and you've got a 50, and then you're like, well, why am I? And then it breeds comparison, and it breeds like, which an art is never supposed to be about that. It's supposed to be about your individual expression. And then now you're being told that you're only a 60 out of 100 in terms of what, like
Yeah.
in terms of what 100 being what, 100 being Vinnie Colaiuta, or 100 being your drum teacher. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
I find those things so obscure, and that's what I love about private lessons, is that's not a thing, that
Right.
they're just trying to help you become a better musician. And on a completely different tangent with the mindfulness thing, I think more teachers, more private teachers and more institutions should be teaching meditation and breathing exercises. And, like part of your warm-up routine, I think should incorporate really honing in on where you are and what you're about to go and do. And, before I play every single night, no matter if it's a wedding gig or a cruise ship gig or anything that I've done, I make sure that I take as many breaths as I need to really come into the room in that space. Because there have been times on cruise contracts where the night has honestly flashed before your eyes, and then you're in bed and you're like, I cannot remember any of it, because you're so like, you're thinking like, oh, do you think that girl took what I said last night? Like,
Right. Yeah.
was she like annoyed by that, or this, or oh, I wonder what time the canteen closes tonight. And it's like all this mad shit, because you're at a level with the shit, or not a level, but it's like a comfortability with the material,
Yeah.
where you can just switch off, and then you're not listening to anyone really. You're kind of in your own little world. And that's why I think meditation, when I took up meditation for the first time ever during COVID, because obviously that was like quite an anxiety provoking time of life, and it changed my life completely, and
Yeah.
it was the same in Benny Grebb's book. There was one sentence that got me into meditation. He was like, without addressing the elephant in the room, everyone should be meditating, and I was like, oh my God, like, is it that obvious that I'm missing out on this like thing that these musicians are doing? And I started to do it, and honestly, like, not only do you take that into music, but you take that into wider life, and
Yeah.
sometimes then you're not as harsh on yourself, or you come off and you think, yeah, that wasn't maybe my best performance, but those are certainly things that I can constructively work on, rather than I used to go down this like self-hate spiral, and like, maybe this isn't for us after like a bad audition, it's like,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, for anyone who wants to dabble in mindfulness, or like just trying to be present, but kind of feels maybe overwhelmed by like the idea of like meditation, because there's so many like brands of it in different ways that, so the two books that I would point to, one we've talked about a couple times, Effortless Mastery, talks about it. It's written for musicians, so it can be very, very literally, he gives you exercises to do at your instrument, so it's very applicable for
yeah,
musicians. But the other one is, and I'm almost done reading it, it's called Being Aware of Being Aware. It's by Rupert Spira, maybe. It's really interesting, and like, I'm gonna butcher it because it's a pretty, like, it's not, there's a reason why there's only a few books that I've been able to latch onto, because it is a weird topic to talk about. But he talks about like awareness is, so in your life you have two different things that like impact you. You have your thoughts, and you have like the things that happen to you. Those are the two things that make up like your existence. You have thoughts and you have events that happen. And then, you know, he talks a lot about how most of our experience is the thoughts and how our thoughts interact with what happens to us. But I think his whole point in the book is kind of like, well, when you really think about it, if you zoom out, you know, our whole life is spent like feeling like we need to work toward meditation, work toward being present, because, you know, we have all these thoughts and we got to get rid of these thoughts and we got to get better at being more mindful and work toward it. And he's like, in reality, like when you're experiencing things and when you're having thoughts, there is something in us that is observing those two things. And that is awareness. So above thoughts and events, there is just awareness. And it's something that we always have because we're always observing our actions and our thoughts. And it's the only thing that we don't, it's kind of like breathing. Like we just breathe. And yeah, we can like think about our breath and take deep breaths or whatever, but like our breathing is just kind of happening. And his whole point is like meditation or mindfulness isn't really a thing that we have to earn. It's something we just kind of have to notice is always going on. Like there's always something observing our thoughts and that's like that, you know, in counseling with anxiety and depression, like they talk a lot about how like you aren't your thoughts. Like a lot of times it can feel like, oh, I am anxious, when in reality, no, you're having an anxious thought. But your awareness is just observing that anxious thought. Like you yourself are not. And like, I think that, you know, we have, it's just, man, you know, and I'm not a mental health counselor. I'm not a, you know, so I can't tell you how to live your life or tell you what's right for you. But I think that me going to counseling, understanding more about my anxiety, where it comes from, some of the triggers of it, like has really, really helped me not only in life, but in music, realize that like so many of the things that I do are like so many of the musical things I gravitate toward, so many of the struggles I've had as a musician, like mostly as like a professional musician, wrestling with this like art versus commerce thing, like all of this stuff, a lot of it stems out of like anxiety and things that I learned from like a really early age that I'm just now starting to realize have like influenced every, you know, part of my journey. And it's like, you know, I think growing up, I didn't get a lot of like my parents, and I love my parents and they were so great, but they aren't the parents that when you get done with like a swim meet or a concert, they're like, you were amazing, you were so great, blah, blah, blah. And that's good, I think, in a lot of ways, because it meant that like, you know, I wasn't doing some swim meet and getting like last place and then being like, you were the best out there or whatever. But the flip side of it is like, you know, I've spent my whole life potentially becoming a performer. You know, there's always nature versus nurture, chicken or the egg thing, but it's like I think that because my parents weren't as forthcoming with like, you're so great, you're amazing, like that's gonna make you want to perform and get someone to tell you that you're amazing or that you sound great or whatever. So it's like there are a lot of, you know, I'm an Enneagram 3, and I think a lot of those personality traits show up. And I think back to like, oh yeah, I wasn't really raised in an environment where my parents were my biggest, and they supported me in everything I did. They just weren't the type of parents that were like, we baked you a cake because you played your first orchestra concert or whatever. And, you know, because of that, I think that it shows up in different ways. And I think that like, you know, the more you can learn about yourself, the more you can carry it into whatever you're doing. And I think that like music as a creative thing, like you were saying earlier, like the point of art is to like talk about yourself. And it turns out that I think that like, unfortunately, it's hard to tell if you go on the internet, but like I think we have a lot more in common with each other than we do not in common with each other. And like when you make art, regardless of what it means for you, a lot of times if it's just coming from a really true place because of work you've done to find out more about yourself, someone else will hear it. And even if they take it, like the Kendrick Lamar album that just came out, like my experience on planet Earth and Kendrick's experience on planet Earth are like could not be less similar.
Yeah.
But he's making art that still rings true with me, because at the end of the day, like the human experience is one that like, and that's the other thing about anxiety, depression, it makes you want to think like you're the only one that's ever experienced this. That's why it's so hard, when in reality, like I think all of us have a little bit of anxiety or depression, and like almost anyone can relate to feelings of, no, I'm not good enough, or I totally fucked that up, or you know, that person hates me and never wants to speak to me again. Like we've all experienced some level of that stuff. And you know, I don't know how this became a like a mental health podcast, because I'm definitely not qualified for it, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. I mean, I'm a super advocate of it, and I think it's so important, like you're saying. And I think another misconception from maybe musicians who are on the come up is that even the elite level pros do not still feel those things. You know, like even for my podcast, I've done, I think this is maybe my 13th, and I know you have done a bunch with some like elite level guys, and like, you know, every one of them that I've spoken to has said that there was a time where they genuinely felt like why them, you know, like why, you know, why were they chosen? And then, you know, you're sitting on the other side of the table and you're like, well, it's because you're absolutely unreal, and you know, you do X, Y, and Z just to an insane level, you know. But and it's so interesting, you know, looking inversely and then looking towards someone else's, you know, what you think that they bring, because what you fail to realize then is that other people see that in you. You know, so someone will look at you and say, oh, you did this like really well, and you're like, oh really? Like, you know, so I think it's finding an identity is difficult in music, especially when, like you said, you know, we're taught from a young age this is the right way to do it, and these are the people that you should follow, and then you start following these people, and then you start taking their, you know, I think everything comes from influence from other people, but I just think the influence should be, well, he played a sextuplet, I wonder what else you could do with that, rather than I'm just going to play that one sextuplet in exactly the way that he's played it for everything that I now do. And then that becomes your whole identity as a musician. I think when you truly find identity is when you branch out and you just go after the things you like. You like electronic music, or you like, you know, really intense dubstep, and you found a niche and a way to play that on a drum kit. Like that's amazing. That's your thing, you know. Like you should, just because it's commercial, you shouldn't. You know, I saw a post about someone the other day. They were like, "Oh, I really should get into linear drumming now," and I was like, "But you won't go very far, because what does that mean? You should follow it if it interests you and if you love it." And if you really like it, like I love it, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's a sound of its own, and I think it's super useful in a lot of situations. But I would never be on as far in as I am if I thought that's what I had to. And I think that's where education misleads, is it's like, no, you need, you know, there are obviously the fundamentals, right? You know, you need basic level technique and, you know, certain levels of, personally, I believe everyone should at least attempt to try and read at some point. Just because it advances those further developments of study. But I think that's where the education train goes a bit misleading, is it's like, oh no, these are the things that you should study. And that's kind of, you know, you just keep studying that. And it's like, I don't personally think that's true. You know, on ships, they were, the entire world told me that I had to be like a really good jazz musician to go on ships. And I'm not, and I don't ever feel the need to be, nor do I ever want to. I don't want to be a jazz musician. I think it's cool. I think what those guys do is amazing, and I can appreciate it, but I'm not going to dedicate my like 90% of my practice time to doing that, because that's what ships require, because I've now played on ships for 4 years, and as long as you can get through a jazz chart, that's all you need. You know?
Well, it's like, yeah, I mean, I think education I think it's a human response to want things to be yes or no. It's a human response to want things to be right or wrong. And I think that the issue is really nothing works like that. And then two, I think that with music, like, you know, to educate people, there, you go like, this is the wrong way to do it, this is the right way to do it. And I think that even when you're doing that from a great place, like there is no technique that you need to play drums. I can hand a pair of drumsticks to a 7-year-old and they can hit the drums and the drums will make sounds.
Yeah.
And I don't have to tell them how to hold the sticks. They can hold it between their fingers all weird and like it will still make sound. So there is no correct way to hit the drums, but like something you said earlier, like it's about trade-offs. So you don't need to read music. There are plenty of musicians that have put out art that has connected with millions and millions and millions of people, and they don't know how to read music. But if you're not going to learn how to read music, there is a trade-off where it might limit what you can do. And it's the same with technique. Like there is no correct way to hit drums. There just isn't. You can hit them with your hands. You can hit them with a pencil and like a spatula. Like you can play them however you want. The thing is, if you want to play drums really, really fast, it's easier to play drums fast certain ways than others. If you need to play drums for 4 hours straight for this show you're doing, there's ways to do that are ergonomic, that are less likely to hurt you. And then there are ways that you can do it where you're probably going to hurt yourself. One is not right or wrong. It's like that is the trade-off of like, if you have really bad posture and you're hitting the drums in a way that isn't working with physics, it's working against physics, it's just going to hurt. And when you do that repetitively every night for 2 to 4 hours, like at the end of the summer, when you're done with the tour, like you're gonna hurt. You didn't play drums wrong, you just played drums in a way that's gonna hurt you. And I think that it's our responsibility as musicians to kind of fight for the areas where we go, like you're saying, like, I want to know more about linear drumming, I'm gonna do it. But to realize that, like, just because you want to do it doesn't mean and this is the thing, like, but you see this in everything. Like, I love whiskey, I love cocktails. They're the people that like whiskey that think if you like whiskey, you can only drink whiskey, like, neat.
Yeah.
Or if it's high proof, you can put 1 ice cube in or whatever. And it's like, no.
Or it has to be Scotch. That's the one that gets me.
Yeah. And it's like, dude, you can literally drink whiskey any way you want. Like, because you can, and like, there are people that are like, well, certain whiskeys are for cocktails and certain ones. It's like, no, if you can put a set of ingredients together that taste good, what would it matter if it's a really, really nice whiskey or a really, really terrible whiskey? Or there are all these rules that, like, the pursuit of learning more about something becomes the pursuit. And I feel like as creatives, it's really important to, like, always, I think that right now we live in a world where it's easier to consume than it is to create. And I don't even mean like create, you have to be putting out air quotes content all the time. But like I was saying, in college, like I didn't have an Instagram at that point. I didn't have a YouTube channel at that point, but I was constantly like recording myself at the end of a practice session, just experimenting with an idea, and then listening back to it a couple days later just to be like, does that sound good? Does that sound bad? Whatever. Like, you need to be trying to put things together in a way you've never done it before, more than you're just consuming and collecting more and more, like, stuff. And I think that in anything, in cocktails, in wine, in coffee, in whatever you want to get into, it becomes easier to collect stuff and less, and then it becomes about collecting more stuff and less about putting to use that stuff, and that's where you get like someone who has like a room literally full of guitars, and then a 3 closets full of guitar pedals, and you're like, oh, so like what can you play, and they know like 7 songs, and it's like something is this, you can spend your money however you want, but it's like, I can guarantee you didn't start playing guitar because you were like, do you know what would be awesome? Is if one day someone walked in and their reaction was like, you have way too many fucking guitars. Like, that's not why you started playing. That's not why anyone starts playing guitar. They play, like, when I was on tour at the beginning of April, I went to this music shop, and like the music shop downstairs was like, it was like kind of like a local version of a Guitar Center, and they had like, lower end and mid-range quality instruments, whatever. And I was like, okay, that's fine, whatever. But then there was like this upstairs part where it was literally a showroom of like priceless guitars that you could not play, you could not touch. Each of them had like a little decal that said like how rare they were and like what year it was and and they were almost like, they were all like Fender, I think. And I was like, this is like the most astronomical waste of money you could ever imagine. Like, what is the point of all of these instruments that no one can play? And then I guarantee the person that owns them has never played.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't make any sense. But for whatever reason, there seems to be like, it's like we all have that mentality of like the Jeffrey Bezos that makes $180 billion, but still is making more. And it's just like, it's not logical. You can't spend that amount of money.
Yeah.
But we all have that somewhere inside of us where like we want it. I don't know what it is, but we want the room full of guitars because it's getting at something that we actually want. But it's easier to collect the guitars than it is to spend the time trying to figure out how to say something interesting on them.
I completely agree. I cannot agree more. There's someone that I follow on Instagram, and they've every week they've got a new piece of equipment, or they've got, a new pedal. And it's like, by now they would have had like 4 or 5 pedals, or they bought an SPD. And then part of you is thinking like, what's the necessity for that though? If you want to get to grips with the SPD and you want to learn how to do, play like live and live sampling and all that sort of cool stuff, if that is what you're genuinely interested in, but don't get an SPD because a pro on TV said they use an SPD. Like what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. That just could be because they're on a pop gig and they need to replicate samples that happened in the track. What if your gig is just down the pub? Like where you're just bashing through a bunch of songs, having a great time. Like, you don't need to constantly chase that thing. And I think the thing with unlimited resources now, I was speaking to Rich Redmond on this podcast. He was saying, back in the day, they had like 4 or 5 drum books, Stick Control, probably Master Studies by Joe Morello, probably a Syncopation, like they had like a staple, like 4 books. So you played through those 4 books, and that's where you get most of your ideas from. And then you try and listen to your favorite drummers on the radio. Now there's probably millions and billions of pieces of material that could pull you in any direction. Mm-hmm. And I think what I've certainly done over the last few years is I've literally just put horse blinkers on, and I'm like, I am literally just going to do what I enjoy. So I limited it to like a few things, like maybe like linear playing, 16-stroke grooves with a hi-hat, 16-stroke hi-hat grooves, like I keep forgetting by Michael McDonald, halftime shuffle grooves, and then just a really strong sense of time. And then you think like, that is my little sphere for now until, the next thing comes along that I want to do. And then you notice the improvements, they're not incremental, they're quite substantial because you're giving them the actual time they deserve, rather than just like you dabble here one week and then you're like, oh, well, I got up to page 4 in Syncopation, but now I watched a Lana Lewis video and now I want to do, this other stuff. And then it's like, you leave that alone for a year and then you come back and then no wonder you're not very good at it anymore because it's out of practice. I think the biggest thing I do now is I practice kind of similar things, and I every now and then you'll get songs that'll push your boundaries. And then you might delve into where they originated from and things like that. But I think primarily now, and that's the biggest thing I learned from effective practice for musicians, was just choose a few things and actually notice how you get good, like you said. So I'd love to speak to that guy that I know, that I follow, that just keeps buying stuff. Like I don't think he's, I don't think he plays as a pro or anything, but like you said, he's clearly in this collector's habit, and then it becomes more about showing off the equipment you have rather than how you can actually use it.
Yeah.
And to
Well,
me,
and I mean,
that blows my mind,
and I think that, like, again, everyone's allowed to do what they want. Like, if that guy just loves collecting guitars and stuff, and like, I think there's a way to do it where like you're aware that you aren't getting better at drums, or you aren't getting better at guitar just by collecting guitar. Like, there's a way to do it that isn't like, evil or whatever. But I think that there are a lot of people that don't realize how much like watching another drum YouTube lesson isn't going to help.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, at some point you just gotta go out, and it's like me, like, I'm a pretty handy guy. I do a lot of stuff that, like, I'm about to redo. I'm in my studio right now. I'm about to redo the floors. I'm going to take the carpet out, put in floors. It's going to be great. It's going to sound better. It's going to look better. It's going to be awesome. I've watched like 20 videos on how to like put in vinyl flooring, and I can continue to watch YouTube videos on how to do it. But at some point, I'm going to have to go buy the flooring, break out my sawhorses and my saw, and I'm just going to start having to put stuff down, cut stuff, and see what happens. And until then, I'm not getting any better. And I can literally, from now until the day I die, I can watch 10 putting in flooring YouTube videos a day. But if I never ever go buy the flooring and start doing it, I won't be getting better. But the tricky thing is, I will be able, at some point, I will reach a level just by consuming all that stuff. I will be able to talk as if I have put in flooring. And I do think that's a lot of times what like people mistake the aware, like the knowledge of a thing as the thing. Like, and that's like, I talk all the time about like cinematography and writing and like TV shows or whatever, because I love TV, and I love shows like Mad Men that are so well written and how are so stylized and whatever. I love talking about it, and I can talk about it, and I can talk about like, rack focuses and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, like, I'm not a filmmaker. And like, although I could convince someone who knows nothing about it as if I had some real skill in it, like at the end of the day, if you were like, oh, you're a filmmaker, okay, show me how to, I'd be like, yeah, I don't know how to do that. Straight up, just don't know how to do it. And I think that we are getting to a point where, like, and same with basketball, I love talking about how this player is washed up now and it's all about this player and the reason they can't win is this, or blah blah blah. It's like, guess what, I've spent zero time playing organized basketball, let alone professional basketball, let alone in the NBA, let alone in NBA finals. Like, I don't know anything about it, but I've watched enough basketball where I can talk about it. And I think that's the interesting thing. And then maybe that's the thing that those people are getting out of it, where they go like, well, I own this many instruments and I've watched this many videos and I can talk about it, and I know what this person thinks and this person thinks and this person thinks and this person thinks. But all of that stuff, again, the thing that's missing in all of that is you actually doing it and then seeing what it's like and having your own unique experience with it. Because until you sit down and do it, you don't have the experience, you just have the knowledge of the experience. And there's a really, really big difference. And that's what I tell everybody who's like, I have a lot of students that move to Nashville and go to like college here and are studying music, and they're like, what do I need to do to be ready to play as a professional? And I'm like, man, you need experience. You need experience. You need experience, because there's nothing in a practice room that can do what playing a show can do. It just, until you're playing a bunch of shit. And that's why you have, like, you have a lot of drummers that don't have technique, that don't know how to read music, that don't have a lot of those skills, but they've just played so many shows. they can get by on a professional level, because experience does teach you like instantly what you need, what you don't need, what helps, what hurts. Like, and I think that it's the same with even just getting better at an instrument. It's like you can continue to watch videos, but until you really start making some decisions to chart your own path on what you want to explore. And I think that if you want to get better as a musician, you need to get better at saying no to what you don't want. Like, you need to be able to, when someone rattles off like 10 different topics you could explore, saying no to every single one of them that isn't going to get you closer to whatever your goal is. And if you don't know what, if your goal is to get better, that is too broad of a goal to get you anywhere. Like, you need, like you're saying, you need to know, like, okay, I want to get better at this, and I want to get better at this, and if I have some time, I want to get better at this. And then if you have that clear of a focus, people are going to be like, dude, you got to go check out blah, blah, blah. And you can be like, man, I might watch it for entertainment. I might watch it because I'm curious, but that's not what I'm working on right now. And I think that too many people are just kind of like, I need to learn it all. And in trying to learn it all, they learn almost nothing. And I think that Kenny Werner does a great job at like going really deep on a very, very small amount of stuff will get you a lot further than trying to learn all of it a little.
Yeah. And I think these videos that are like, you know, these clickbait YouTube drum fills that are like, you know, 5 blazing drum fills in 5 minutes. And, you know, you see them all the time from even some of the biggest creators on the YouTube. But what they're failing to show you is how you can personally construct that. Yeah, I like, you know, if it's like nine times out of 10, they'll either be a sextupler or 32-second notes, you know, it's like 9 out of 10. So then you think, okay, why don't you just show me the different variations that one bar of 8 notes can get you how far, rather than saying, because all the difference is going to be is an orchestration. So it'll be like, you know, someone might go kick, kick, right, right, left, right, blah, 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 blah. And then the next drummer might go right, right, left, blah, 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 kick, 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 kick. It's the same shit. It's exactly the same. There's no difference because the notes are the same. And what they fail to say is like, I think there's a lack of thing in education where it's like, do you want to learn how to construct that in 400 million different ways? That will even blow these guys' minds, because they've clearly sat there and gone, right, I got 8 notes. This is the pattern I'm going to do. Okay, record it, blah, blah, blah. That's the lesson I'm going to teach. What use is that? Teaching me a phrase of 32-second notes. Where, under what context? You know, like, at least if they were like, you know, great Motown fills, you know, and it was just gabadoom, doom. Fucking great. That's really applicable to the style of music. But saying, you know, blazing fill, you know, it's like, what does that do?
Well, and that gets to something you said, like all the way at the beginning of our thing, is like art versus commerce. Like, we have this weird thing now where, and this is the thing that I struggle with most actively, is like, so there are things I can do that I know will make me money. There are things that I can do that I know will get me clicks. And then there are a lot of things that I just like, and I don't know if it's going to do either of those things. So where do I spend my time?
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, that's something that I think it's really, really tough as a person who's, you know, if you're making a living putting content on YouTube, like, how do you find the balance of like giving the audience, making something that people want because you know people want it, and making something that is like actually going to teach them something that will, like, you know, are you going to give a man a fish or give a person a fishing rod and teach him how to fish, or whatever that phrase is, like, and that's kind of like, you know, because in reality, I think most of the people that are putting those videos out, and I've put videos out like that, like a lot of times when I'm doing it, I'm like, oh, you know, I'm doing it because people will click it and it'll get views or whatever. But you're also doing it because, like, that's like the market wants what the market wants. And at some point, like that's like, I go back to like that course Drumming Minimalism that I made. Like when I sold it, it didn't sell great because like, I think people were just kind of like, what is this?
Yeah.
And that's partly like from a marketing standpoint, that's partly my fault for not communicating the offer correctly, if you want to get market term on it. But in reality, like regardless of how great your marketing is, if what you're trying to put out is so far apart from what people normally consume, that gap might be too much for them to cross. So like if you have the bulk of the people watching drum lessons on YouTube, if the bulk of those people are like, I just want 5 fast fills that make me faster drummers in faster time, or whatever the hell people title those things, you know what I mean? Like if someone is going to YouTube and that's most of what they consume, getting that person all the way to like, hey guys, here's an 1.5 hour long video of this 3-note grouping that we're going to play 10,000 different ways because that's actually more beneficial. Like sometimes the gap can just be too far apart between like, you know, and I'm sure it's no different than like what, you know, doctors sometimes when they have patients who are like have been chain smoking for like, you know, their whole life. It's like, what really will help you the most is just not smoking anymore. But if that's not feasible, what is in between? And I think that that's like really hard. I think most people that are making content know that like the thing that people gravitate toward is the easy, like, I mean, at this point with TikTok, people are making 30-second long air quotes drum lessons. You really can't learn that much. You can get you can get a flash of the experience of knowing drums, but you can't get an experience of drums in 30 seconds. But people get addicted. I mean, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all of those companies have spent billions of dollars figuring out how to get dopamine hits and then presenting more and more content that keep you on that app longer because it's triggering your dopamine response. Like though it's not people's fault, it is these companies that are controlling the algorithms. And I think that that's what's so frustrating putting stuff out onto the internet right now, is like you can start out, I think it's like a lot of politicians. I think a lot of politicians on either side, you know, they start out wanting to help. I don't think there are many. There are some. I don't think there are many like purely evil politicians. So you start out, you want to help your community, you want to clean up your city, like whatever you start out with. But as you go in, there's a system in place. There are people you have to please. There are bases that you have to pander to make sure that you get the vote so that you can do the blah, blah, blah. And like, I think it's true of like putting content online, like there's a structure here. There's a thing called an algorithm that gets to decide who sees what. And if you aren't willing to engage in the algorithm at all, well, then your videos will likely just be seen by no one. So, okay, now I got to figure out how to get in the algorithm, but still have it be wholesome, truly beneficial content. So then you do that. And then that's hard. And then you do one video that like goes really, really well. And then it's like, okay, that went really well. Now I can do that. And like the whole thing is this weird other game that it's really confusing. And like, I'm not saying this because I want people to feel bad for me. I'm saying it because I think that like that's part of what is controlling how we are educated now about music. Like the algorithm of it all is now controlling what we think is like one of the, I won't say what area of music. There is a company that has spent a bunch of money putting their product in a bunch of music video type, you know, educational spaces. And I think 10 years from now, they're going to become a company where everyone's like, yeah, that product works really, really well. I've seen it in videos for years. Those products are great. And in reality, the experience I've had with them, it's a terrible product. But if people see that product in enough things, it ceases to matter whether or not it is, because like what's happening is like there's a bunch of musicians that want nice, perceived nice product, and this company is saying, I will give you that as long as you'll put it in your video. And people are doing it because, not because they think this is the best product, they think, wouldn't it be nice to have thousands of dollars worth of this product? And then 10 years from now, they will have elbowed their way into a certain market share, and people will they'll have a reputation, and not because they are better, but because they marketed their way there. And I think that that's true of like an algorithm that's controlling what you see. It's like, no, those 5 fun, fast, freaking drum fills for the Friday fill drummer, or, you know, those stupid titles, like, no, those are not the most helpful kind of drum lessons. If your only goal is, I want to get as good at being creative on an instrument as I can, like those might not be the quickest way there. But there's going to be no way to know that 7 years from now, when all we have is like people that have been raised in a culture where if you go onto YouTube and you type drum lesson, those are the drum lessons that come up. So eventually the algorithm will change how we perceive education and what we think works in education, whether it works or not.
Yeah, I think sometimes I can be slightly naive and ignorant in the sense that like I have such blinkers on about my own life and my own career that I want to be the best that I can possibly ever be, and I push myself to that standard. I then can sometime, well, I can put that, and I think that everyone should or is doing that, you know. So, you know, there are drummers, millions of drummers out there that probably just love going onto YouTube and typing in, I want to learn a quick drum fill for the day, and for them that gets them going. You know, that's not my path. But then, like you said, like what's right and what's wrong. I just think maybe I need to become better at thinking like it's okay that's their thing. You know, like it's okay to be hobbyists and to just enjoy.
Yeah.
You know, like I enjoy it, but I enjoy it because it's like something for me to. I really want to be an elite level player, and everything that entails. You know, that has brought me on my own path. But it's also fine if people do not want to do that. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah, I think that, you know, it's all, yeah, like, yeah, it's not, again, it's not that any of those lessons are right or wrong. It's like, what do you want out of it? Again,
Yeah.
it's like, you don't need German grip, but it can be really useful depending on what you're going for. And it's like the same thing. It's like, man, if you're just a hobbyist and you want to have fun, like, then simply learning a new order of things that when you put it together, it sounds like a new fill that you can play with that play along track you've had for 2 months. Great.
Yeah.
But I think that the interesting thing is like how much, like you were saying, like Rich Redman is like, you know, we had 5 books and everybody worked through those books, and there was a certain way that we worked through them, and that was education. At that point, maybe those books were truly great, and that's why Syncopation and Stick Control and all those books have like stood the test of time. Or maybe it's just what people had.
Yeah.
And people use them. And I've worked through all of those books, and
Yeah.
I've gotten great benefit out of it. But, you know, I think every era is sometimes convinced that their era is doing it right. And this is in everything. I mean, God, talk to your parents about like music, or about like how much nudity there is on TV or whatever. And like every generation is consumed and convinced that they're, or even more universal, every generation has an opinion about which SNL cast was the best. And it's almost always the SNL cast that was like late high school into the first couple of years of university. Those are the prime years, and you can go and they'd be like, oh, SNL used to be funnier, and it's like, no, you were just a different age when it came out. And it's like, I think it's just important to notice that like I think we're going to look back and I've listened to like Bo Burnham is one of my favorite people, like putting things into the world right now. And like, he's been in a lot of interviews, he's talked about like, I think in 50 years, we're all going to look back at how we interacted with technology for the era we're living in right now. And he's like, it's going to be kind of like smoking. We're going to look back in 50 years and be like, what the fuck were we doing? Like, clearly a human being shouldn't be spending 7 hours a day looking at a little screen they're holding in their hand. And especially when the things they're looking at for those 7 hours are things like Facebook and Instagram that are algorithms that are putting things in front of you to keep you on the app longer, period. That is what they care about. I want you to be on the app longer. And the algorithm is just finding new and new ways to keep you on the app longer, regardless of what it does for you, or regardless of how good it is for you. That algorithm is just trying to keep you there longer. And like, we're going to look back in 50 years and be like, oh, I don't think we did that right. I think we should have realized that like, if we're reprogramming our brain to respond to certain things, certain stimuli in the world, if we're reprogramming our brain, literally how it reacts to things based on this app that doesn't care about us, but just cares about us being on the app longer, like, we're going to look back and think, we should have thought about this sooner.
I've just realized we've been speaking for like an hour and a half, and I haven't asked you one question on my sheet. So maybe we'll try and quickly go through these. It's been so enjoyable though. Like, I mean,
man, let's do it. Let's do a speed round, and then we'll see where we're at.
Okay, cool. So bullet pointed, how did you get from picking up your first pair of sticks to being Dan Lewis from Wales's favorite music charter and a great musician and a great human?
Well, short version is I would bang on a bunch of tables around the house, and one day my dad got fed up with it, got me a terrible electronic Yamaha like 7-pad electronic drum kit thing. And eventually I played it so long that like it broke, the sticks broke, and I begged my parents. They finally got me a drum set. I was like 10 at that point. I taught myself for the first 3 years. Then right around the 3rd or 4th year, I was realizing like I'd been on Drummer World and Vic Firth, and I'd learned a bunch from watching those videos, but I just didn't really know what to do next. Started getting private lessons, studied privately up until college, got into college, got a degree in music performance at Belmont, Nashville. And all the while I was in high school, while I was in college, I was playing as much as I could, not only studying and practicing, but I was playing with like people as much as I could. So I always had bands in high school. And then in college, I was like, as much as I could, I would go out on the weekends and play for artists that were like touring around Nashville. I was just like trying to play as much as I could. And then I graduated college, started playing with a band called Remedy Drive right after college, toured with them 2 years full time. And then from there, played with a bunch of country artists. And then, 5-ish years ago, I stopped touring full time, and then started doing more YouTube stuff and my website and transcribing and teaching lessons. And, in the last 3 years or so, I've started doing more studio stuff. And that's kind of like the real thing I'm focused on now. But yeah.
That was a real speed round. And so
I'm gonna do a podcast episode because I have recordings from pretty much every stage of my life from me playing music. And a podcast episode I want to do is, because growing up, I was always curious, like, am I good enough to be a professional? Because I didn't grow up in a town where there were a bunch of musicians. So like literally when I was 12, I was kind of like, could I ever could I ever do this for a living?
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a podcast episode where I take you through like every stage of my drumming, from like as early as I have recordings through high school, through college, because I still have my band's recordings in high school, like high school all the way through college, all the way through like the first album I tracked. I'm just going to do a whole like history, because I think that I again, growing up, I was always just like, what did Dennis Chambers sound like when he was 14? That would either encourage me or maybe be like, oh shit, he was way better than I am right now. But either way, I think that there's not enough people showing the process of the thing. It's just
I
kind of,
agree.
so yeah.
I
All right,
agree.
what's next on your sheet?
You are an insane charter of music. When was it that you realized that that was something that you could like commercially sell? And when did Zildjian and Vic Firth come along to ask you to do it?
Yeah, so I, even up through like I took private lessons. I could read a little bit of music, but by the time I started taking private lessons when I was like 14, my playing was way ahead of my reading. So that followed me into college. Like when I got to college, people were like sight reading circles around me. I could like barely read. I couldn't read music, and like I couldn't read drum notation in real time. And I could barely, like, it would take me forever to figure out like two measures of just like basic groove. I just wasn't good at reading, and I'd kind of relied on my ear to get me through almost every situation. And it kind of started to haunt me in college because I was starting to realize that like if you want to play a gig and have play 40 songs and learn those 40 songs in like 2 days, you can't do it by ear, or I can't. So it was starting to be apparent to me that like whether it's just charting or it's like reading formal drum notation, I just wasn't doing a good enough job if I wanted to get where I wanted to go. And then on top of that, I was starting to get to a point halfway through college where I was studying drummers like Calvin Rogers, where I loved his playing, but there really weren't the like YouTube lessons that everyone was breaking down every Phillies at like, if so I was just not, he was playing a bunch of stuff I wanted to know what he was playing, but no one was really breaking it down. So I was just like, all right, I'm gonna try and figure it out. So at that point, to get a measure of drumming transcribed would literally take me hours. Like it would take me 2 hours to get together like a measure of his drumming. And then I'd play it back in Finale, because at that point I still wasn't great at reading. So I would hit play in Finale and it would play it back and I'd be like, oh shit, that is not right. Like, why isn't it right? Like, what's going on? So it was like, that would have been 2011 is where I really started to be like, okay, man, I want to figure out how to get better at transcribing. So in college, I started transcribing more. And then after I graduated, I, when I was on tour, I would always have something I was transcribing, because I'd be like, man, that was a really cool solo. I just want to transcribe it. So I started putting it on my website, which at the time, literally no one was going to, but I was just like, I don't know. I liked knowing what this was, so I'm sure someone might too. And like over the years, I would be on the road and transcribing stuff and just always kind of like chipping away at something. And then after a while, people would just start reaching out being like, hey, I saw you had a transcription of this. Like, have you ever transcribed this thing? And I'd be like, oh, no. And then eventually I realized like, wait, I haven't, but like I could.
Yeah.
And this person could pay me for it. So, I don't know, it was a couple years after I graduated. So like probably around 2014 or so where I started like charging people. Ash Sohn was one of the first people. He had me transcribe his like play alongs he was doing at the time. And I charged him almost nothing, because I was essentially like, I don't know what to charge for this. Like,
Yeah.
and at the time I was touring, so I was either like doing it in the back of a bus, or I was doing it on my days off when I was just sitting at home. So I was like, man, I don't know, I got nothing else to do. Like, if this random person on the internet wants to pay me $25 to do it, like, sure, I'll do it. And then as time went on, like more and more people were doing it, and I was putting out more of it, and people were finding it and being like, can you transcribe this? So all the while I was a Vic Firth artist, and at some point I reached out to Vic Firth and I was just like, hey, I have all these transcriptions I've done over the years. If you guys ever want it, let me know. And they were kind of like, that's cool, like, good to know, great. And then years went on, and like every now and then I would do a transcription of one of their artists, and I'd send it and be like, hey, I just did this transcription, just wanted you to know, like, I don't know if you guys could use it for anything. And they'd be like, that's really cool, I don't think we need it, but thanks for reaching out. And then eventually the VF Jams project came up, and they were like, hey, I thought about you because I know you transcribe and you put some stuff out and we've seen it and it's awesome. And we have this project and maybe we can transcribe some of them. So, I think the whole thing is a good example of like, there was no one in college. I was studying to be a professional musician, and there was 0 people in college that ever mentioned that you could get paid to transcribe stuff. Because it's just not really a thing that many people did. And it's very, very specific. I only transcribe drum stuff. So, I think that really taught me that, like, if you can find an audience for something, you can get them to pay you for it. And, it was just a very slow process to figure out how much to charge, like when to charge, and, yeah. And now I've worked with so many drummers that I never would have guessed because of just kind of keeping doing it. And yeah.
Yeah. And so what insights have you gained, firstly, from transcribing their stuff in terms of drums, and secondly, from speaking with them on your podcast?
Well, I think one of, like, the biggest insight I could give people is, like, a lot of times there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, regardless of how insane the drummer is, at the end of the day, you really can boil most drummers down to, like, they got a couple tricks.
Yeah.
They just know how to play those tricks every way, upside down, backward, forward, starting on the beginning of the beat, reversing it, like any rudiment that they, like Calvin Rogers is a great example. Like almost everything, every fill that guy plays that I would transcribe, because I'd be like, dude, what is this fill? It's insane. I would get done with the transcription and be like, oh, it's a paradiddle diddle. So was the last one I did. He just knows how to play a paradiddle diddle in every way imaginable. And every time he does it, you go, wow, what on earth was that? And then you transcribe and you're like, oh, how is this a paradiddle diddle? And I think that that's really probably the biggest thing that I've learned is, like, a lot of your favorite drummers are not masters of every single rudiment in every single genre and every single thing. They've picked 2 or 3 things that they've gone super, 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 super deep with. The exceptions being Jojo Mayer,
Yeah,
and Mike Mitchell.
okay.
And those 2 dudes, when I transcribe them, I'm like, I don't know what's happening. But for most drummers, like by the end, like by 30 seconds into a drum solo, you can kind of know, like, okay, they like doubles more than they like singles. They're a paradiddle diddle kind of person, or they're like a double paradiddle person. Like there's all these things that, like, over time you just kind of learn, like, oh, okay, they really like linear fills. Like, oh, this person is the kind of person that always has 8th notes going on the hi-hat with their left foot when there's like all these subtle things that you pick up that, like, when it boils down to it, those are the thing. Like the reason Mark Juliana from Steve Gadd is because of all these little tendencies and all these things that are usually not as complicated as, like, we want them to be.
Yeah, there's some comfort in that, though. No, is to be like, well, the world of drumming is not actually as big as it can sometimes be perceived.
Oh, 1,000,000%. And that's the thing that transcribing reminds me of, is, like, at the end of the day, the hardest thing a drummer has to do is play 4 limbs at the same time. The rest of it is just memorizing or getting to a place where your brain is comfortable with that sequence of notes in that order at that speed. And at the end of the day, that sometimes is as complicated as, like I think transcribing gives you an ability to, like, view a real-time event, which is like someone playing music, outside of the construct of linear time.
Yeah.
And I think that when you can view, it's like Rust Cole in the first season of True Detective, where he's like, if a person could view from a 4th dimension, time would be a flat circle. That's like kind of what a transcription is. It's giving you the ability to view something outside of time And when you can do that, you realize that like, oh, it's just right, left, kick, right, left, kick. When I hear it and when they play it with at speed in that spot with that tone, it sounds unbelievable. But now that I'm seeing it on paper, what it is right, left, kick, or whatever. And like, there is a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah. And so what insights have you gained from speaking with them on your podcast?
I think that like I feel like a lot of my favorite drummers that I've talked to, when you talk to them, you realize that like drums are only one branch. Drums are not the thing. It's a byproduct of the thing. So like the reason you love Benny Greb is not because he loves drums. It's because he loves music. And it's because his approach to music comes from whatever's deeper down than music. You know what I mean? And I think that that's the thing. Like, I think more people should be thinking about like how their personality shows up in their music. Like, why do I like the Beatles? I don't know. Look into it. Ask yourself, like, why do I, I really like dark music. I like angular sounds more than I like round sounds. Like, there's all these things that I've learned that like, I think that every musician I've talked to that has that I feel like has something really cool to say or really insightful to say, at the end of the day, you realize like drums is only one of the things that they've gone there with. Like I had Daniela Mason on my podcast. She's one of my favorite pop artists in Nashville. Like, she loves interior design because whatever she's doing with interior design is getting at the same thing that music gets at. Like, I love whiskey, and it's not because I want to be a whiskey hoarder. It's because like the fun little nuances you can talk about in music and that you can get out of music, you can get out of whiskey. Like, I love TV and I love like True Detective and Mad Men, shows that are kind of dark, shows that are like really character driven. There's a reason for it. And I love the stylized approach to like Winning Time on HBO right now, or like Mad Men. Like, some people don't. But I think it's important as like a creative person, like when I talk to all these people, like it turns out that a lot of times there's a lot of other stuff that they're interested in, other stuff they've thought about, other stuff that, is driving something that's deeper down. And like drums is just one of those things that, and maybe it's like, for me, it would be the most thing that I've pursued, but I've pursued a bunch of stuff in the same way, because at the end of the day, learning is learning. All the things that helped me learn drums have helped me learn all the other skills that I have in my life. And like, I can solve a Rubik's Cube and know how to solve a Rubik's Cube because I know how to practice drums, and they're the same thing.
Yeah.
To get better at something is to get better at something. And I think that like everybody I've talked to like knows that in some way.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's hugely comforting to know, because there's a common misconception that your entire life has to revolve around, your identity, your whole identity is this art form, or this, this byproduct of our art form. And it's comforting to know that at that level, it's not for them, it's just one of the things that they do, and they're a whole person outside of their craft. Yes, they're, most of these guys are masters in their studies, but I think a lot of that also, I was thinking about it the other day, and I think I went through a period of my life where I was in university and I was like, right, I should be getting pop tours, big pop tours, probably by 25, and like 25 came and went and there wasn't one in sight. And then I think I was like, okay, well, right, at least blah, 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 blah. Because I saw Josh Devine do it with One Direction, and they were playing everywhere. And then you get to a time in your life where you're like, the minute you take those restrictions off yourself is one of the most freeing things in the world. And when I looked back and I thought most of my favorite players are easily in their mid-40s, early 50s, you know,
Yeah.
easily. Even if they weren't, we're not on the same pathway. Like me and Mick Fleetwood haven't lived simultaneously going to the same school with the same teachers,
Right.
same experiences. And so I think that's a thing that can bog people down sometimes, is that pressure to be at a certain level or a certain gig by a certain time, you know,
Yeah.
speaking like completely personally on that one as well. So it's actually nice to hear that these guys have complete lives outside of this thing, you know?
Totally. And I think that like on that note, like from the time I was 10, I wanted to play drums and tour. And I want to play drums live. That's all I wanted to do. I didn't want to do anything else. And I went to college and that was still true. And then I graduated and I toured full time and I was doing it full time and I was loving it. And then at some point I realized like, wait, I don't want to do this forever. Like I don't only want to tour forever. I have other
Yeah.
interests now. And it took me a really long time to admit that to myself because I felt like I was giving up on the dream. When in reality, it's like, dude, 10-year-old Tim is an idiot. He doesn't know anything. Like that kid didn't know what the world was going to be like. So to live out 10-year-old Tim's version of life because it's just what I wanted to do when I was 10 is not a great reason to continue to do something. And I think that like in a broader sense, there are a lot of musicians that are like, oh, I'm not a musician because I don't do it full time or whatever. And it's like, of course you are. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like, I have friends that studied music in college and don't tour full time, but they have a normal air quote day job, but they play on the weekends. And it's like, are they a musician? Of course they are. And they sound amazing. Like, are you kidding? Like, I have a friend, she's an incredible vocalist. And like right now, she is a mom. That doesn't mean she's not a vocalist anymore.
Yeah.
It means she's not currently touring full time like she did a couple years ago. Like,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean that you're not a musician anymore. And I think that we do this thing where we feel like if we want to claim that we're a musician, that means that we have to be making X dollars from it or be playing this many shows a month or something. And it's like all of it's just not true. And I like that can really, really hold you back from exploring all that your instrument in music might have to offer you because you deem it like, oh, I'm not legit because I don't do X, Y, and Z. And it's just not true.
Yeah. And I think it's okay for your why to change over time as well. You know, like my why for ships was different when I started than what it is now. You
Yeah,
know, like, and I think, like you said, when other things in your life come in, like parenting, your why changes. You know, maybe you don't want to go on a 13-month tour because you're a new father, or you're getting married,
totally.
like that. And I think those expectations are, especially since COVID, since the Great Resignation, I think like that's been a real nice change in the world, that people are giving up jobs that they actively really dislike for things that they're sacrificing in just different ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are some of your go-tos? Like, you are one of my go-tos for expanding my music vocabulary and my musical education, and a few other sites, mainly like through my ships and some YouTube stuff, but it'll mostly be probably watching live, like Stanley Randolph playing live with Stevie Wonder, or like John Blackwell playing back in the day, or those sorts, or Jonathan Moffat with Michael Jackson, things like that. That's like those are my go-to. What are your go-tos?
Go-tos for
like expanding musical knowledge and like kind of engagement and
man, these days I listen to so much music. I listen to, I would say almost every day I listen to at least one new album. And I'm always listening, like Jack Harlow's album came out, I listened to it. Did I like it? No. But I listened to it. And even though as a whole I didn't like it, there were things I did like on it. And I think that like my biggest thing right now is like I'm trying to listen to as much music as possible, different kinds of music. That's why like every now and then on Instagram I'll put out a poll and be like, hey, like what are some of your favorite albums? Because I don't, and my neighbor who lives next door, like he and I both like craft beer, so we'll have beer, and like he's not a musician, but he loves music, and we'll talk music, and every week he'll text me like, hey man, check out this album, check out this album. And he's like 10 years older than me, so he comes at it from a very different place than like people that are my age would recommend albums, and it's awesome. And I listen to a lot of it, and I go like, he really likes a lot of like 90s rock grunge stuff. It's not a genre I like, but I've listened to a ton of it,
Yeah.
because every time I do, I learn more about like what people were doing as far as sounds go back in that era. It teaches me about different song forms. Like, I just think that more, the more the tendency is the more you learn an instrument, the less you think about music and the more you think about an instrument. And like, boy, oh boy, is that like the worst thing that you can do. And I think that I lived most of my life, like from 10-year-old drummer world era up through college. I was always listening to a lot of music, but I was nerdy about drummers. Like, from a really early age, I was like into Dennis Chambers and Vinnie Colaiuta and Steve Gadd and like all these like drummer people. And I feel like now I'm trying to just listen to music and just get into a like absorbing music as a whole, not just drums. And that kind of coincides with like these days, since I'm doing a bunch of studio stuff, like when I am practicing, a lot of times what I'm doing is like trying to go for a certain kind of drum sound or a certain kind of like vibe sonically on something, which is like a whole different thing. So like a lot of times I'm going to assume if I'm going to consume something that's just like straight up educational and music related, a lot of times it's like an engineer or producer breaking down a certain song they did. Because that not only teaches me some technical things about like this plug-in, or when you're mixing and the mix is really dense, you can do this or that or the other thing, but it also teaches me like the mindset of like, this song is constructed like this is the most important part, and then we added this because it needed something in this frequency range, and then the vocals sit right here, but it, so I'm just trying to think more about music these days and less about like drums.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
That's the perfect answer. Because I think we get so bogged down in listening to our own instrument, like you said, like that drummer thing. I think everyone goes through a phase of just following their idols. Do you have a dream gig?
Man, I have sure. I mean, there are like a ton of people that I would like die to play with. Oh man, like Ariana Grande would be so fun.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a great question. Right now, I'm really listening to a lot of Lizzie McAlpine. Her album is like incredible. She has a song on her new album, 5 Seconds Flat. The song is called Erase Me, features Jacob Collier. And oh dude, it's just like, I mean, that album is like heartbreaking. It's so well done. I would love to play for Halsey. Halsey's probably like my favorite pop artist. That would be incredible. I'd like to play with the saxophone player Chris Potter. I think that would be, he's probably like my favorite musician. So I mean, like playing with him at all would be incredible. So yeah, I don't know.
Really diverse.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Like that's kind of like the worlds that, I listen to a lot of stuff, but like when I'm just putting on an album, generally it's either going to be totally pop or totally like jazz.
Yeah. Okay.
Like there's not like, as far as just like I'm just going to listen to something today, it's usually pretty much nowhere in between. It is either like as pop as it gets, or it is like as weird as it gets.
Yeah, perfect. When it comes to discipline versus motivation, I pulled up just a few quotes here. Motivation produces emotion, but discipline produces results. Motivation is temporary, but discipline preserves. What do you think about that?
That is a really interesting question. To me, it feels a little bit like the groove versus feel.
Right.
At some point, I don't know where one ends and where one begins, because like I feel like just discipline ends up, even if you have the ability to maintain that for a long time, it ends up becoming lifeless at some point, and it ends up usually like fostering bitterness. Just motivation ends up you watching a bunch of YouTube videos to get inspired and never actually like sitting down to do the thing. So I think it just has to, you have to have a healthy balance of like both. And sometimes you might be in a great groove where like every day you wake up, to me that feels a lot like I run, and I ride Peloton. Get at me, I'm one of those people. But you know, like as far as like me, like I want to move my body because it helps my body and my brain. So it's like there, for most of the time I wake up and like I don't have a problem doing it. And that's, so I would say that's discipline. But there are also times where I need to find some way to be motivated because I'm just not as into it. So sometimes that's like, okay, I've been running in my neighborhood and the neighborhood across the street. I'm gonna play basketball. I'm gonna go to a park, take a ball, like play basketball. You know, so sometimes like I think it's just about listening to yourself, your body, your brain, and like trying to figure out like what's gonna help me do the thing today. And because there's something to be said about like, you know, I am a very disciplined person, but then there are times where I go see like a live show and it's amazing, and I go like, holy shit, right, this is why I do it. Or like I recorded one of my favorite podcasts right after I watched Bo Burnham's Inside for the second time. Like that was the motivation I need. I have a ton of discipline. It didn't get me to record the podcast until I saw Inside for the second time, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go do it. And I just walked right upstairs and I did it.
Yeah.
Like, so, you know, I think you just need a healthy balance of both. And it's just about trying to be real with yourself on like which one's really needed, and like making it happen.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful answer. And the last one, advice for players, charters, creatives, people in the arts.
I wish I had something really profound that I could drop on
I think there's a
everyone.
million profound things in this podcast. I wouldn't worry.
Yeah. I mean, I think my biggest piece of advice would be like, be kind to yourself, and like try to start creating from a place where you're trying, every time you're creating, you're trying to find out more about yourself, not trying to do something that someone else wants you to do, or do something that is right or good because that's what people say. Like, I think a lot of people spend a lot of their time, and I think that like one of the biggest things I could suggest for someone is like, go next time you have 10 minutes, go sit down at your instrument and just sit down and see what happens. Just sit down and play something.
Yeah.
I think we get caught up in this never-ending cycle of like, if I'm going to sit down on my drums, I got to get stuff done. So I got to have these exercises, and I got to blah, 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 and I got to learn this song, and I got to whatever. And we forget that like when we were, you know, 10 and we just started playing drums, like I didn't sit down at the drums being like, I got to shed this stuff today. And what I sat down and I just like would hit them and be like, whoa, that was loud and interesting. I didn't realize if I hit the edge of the thing, it would sound like that. Like, that's like, can I do it again? Like when you watch a kid hit drums for the first time, like they don't know what they're doing, but they hit something and go, oh, okay, that's really loud. Oh, okay, that's quieter. I like that a little bit better. Like they're not thinking like, this is right, this is wrong, this is Steve Gadd, this is Vinny, this is Mark Juliana. They're thinking, I right now, I like that.
Yeah.
So I think that like whatever you can do to get back to that, and it's the same, whatever you're doing. If you really like cocktails, go to your bar and go, what could I make that I've never made before? Let me try 1.5 ounces of this, 2 dashes of that, this liqueur, this thing. What does it taste like? Is it great? Amazing. Is it not great? Okay. That's fine. It's not great. Could you change it a little bit? Could you throw in a dash of this? You know what I mean? I think that like we just get into this thing where, because there's so many ways we can find air quotes solutions, we think that every time we sit down at drums, we have to be outputting something. And we don't.
Yeah.
Like we don't.
Yeah.
Like if you leave this conversation and sit down on your drums and do something, I'm never going to hear it. And that's okay. And it doesn't matter if it sounds good. It doesn't matter, like whatever. Like, I don't know. I think that whatever you can do to get back to the exploration and the being fully present when you're playing, do that.
Yeah. I think that ended up being quite profound.
Or I just talked about it long enough to where it's like, well, that was probably pretty good, right?
I think that's a trick anyone could use, and I'll
Yeah.
definitely be having all this cocktail talk. I think I'm going to have a old fashioned tonight. I think.
Now we're talking.